£1 million says I can make that toy soldier blink. That's what tech billionaire Gideon Chase announced before stepping inches from Lance Sergeant Reuben Ashford's face. He's just standing there pretending to be made of marble, Chase sneered. Everyone breaks eventually. What Chase didn't know was that he was about to learn the difference between standing still and standing strong. And what happened next left a courtyard full of millionaires absolutely speechless. But before we reveal how this played out, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Buckingham Palace's cream-coloured forecourt, where 36-year-old Lance Sergeant Reuben Ashford stood in perfect stillness. His scarlet tunic was immaculate, every brass button catching the light like tiny mirrors, his white gloves pristine against the polished wood of his rifle. The bearskin cap tucked under his left arm, summer posting, allowed this small mercy, though it didn't lighten the weight of duty that had shaped his life for the past 18 years. Ashford wasn't just another ceremonial guard playing dress-up for tourists. He'd earned his place here through blood, sweat, and 2 tours in Afghanistan that had taught him what real stillness meant. The kind of stillness that could mean the difference between life and death when insurgents tested your resolve at a checkpoint outside Kandahar. The bullet scar on his right shoulder, hidden beneath the wool tunic, was a permanent reminder that standing your ground sometimes cost more than comfort. His mind drifted briefly to that morning in Helmand Province, 3 years ago, when a young boy had approached his checkpoint with his hands behind his back. Ashford had remained perfectly still then, too, not from protocol, but from training that had been drilled into him until it became instinct. The boy had been carrying a grenade. Ashford's stillness had saved 6 lives that day, though he'd never talked about it. Men like him didn't serve for the stories they could tell, but for the ones they chose not to. This was supposed to be a quiet afternoon. The private charity tour was one of those discreet, invitation-only events that the Crown occasionally hosted for wealthy donors, the sort where Bentleys and Rolls-Royces queued silently outside, and conversations happened in hushed, expensive whispers. No cameras clicking every few seconds. No tourist groups pushing against barriers for selfies. Just silk ties, understated jewellery, worth more than most people's houses, and the kind of money that preferred to stay invisible while still buying influence. That peaceful atmosphere shattered the moment the gunmetal Rolls-Royce Cullinan pulled up to the outer gate like a storm cloud on wheels. Gideon Chase stepped out before his driver could reach the door, his Italian leather shoes hitting the ancient stones with the kind of confidence that had built tech empires and destroyed just as many. 52 years old, silver hair slicked back with expensive pomade, his bespoke charcoal suit worn with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never heard the word no spoken with any real authority. The venture capitalist's laugh carried across the courtyard before his feet were fully planted, loud, sharp, and completely out of place in the hushed reverence that usually surrounded the palace. Chase had made his billions the same way he'd approached everything else in life, by finding things people said couldn't be broken and proving them wrong. 3 collapsed hedge funds, 2 failed energy startups, and 1 very loud private space venture had taught him that everything and everyone had a price. Today, he was looking at what he assumed would be his easiest conquest yet. His 2 assistants scrambled behind him, like remora fish following a shark, clutching phones and notepads like shields, their tight expressions suggesting they'd witnessed their boss's social experiments before and knew exactly how they tended to end. The younger one, barely out of university, with his hair buzzed military short in a pathetic attempt to look serious, kept glancing nervously at the palace guards. The older assistant, a woman in her 30s who'd learned to hide her embarrassment behind designer glasses, had her phone ready to call lawyers, publicists, or whoever else might be needed to clean up the mess she could feel brewing. Chase surveyed the scene through designer sunglasses that cost more than most people's monthly salary, his gaze settling on Ashford with the kind of predatory interest a big game hunter might show a particularly challenging target. The guard stood motionless against the palace's imposing facade, a living statue carved from discipline and tradition that stretched back centuries. "Well, I'll be damned," Chase muttered, loud enough for his entourage and half the other guests to hear. "They're still using department store mannequins for security over here. What's next? Scarecrows with swords?" The other guests, mostly British aristocrats, European nobility, and a handful of foreign dignitaries who understood the weight of protocol, glanced respectfully at the guard before looking away. It was an unspoken rule among people raised with proper breeding. You acknowledged the guards with quiet respect, perhaps a subtle nod, then continued on your way. They were there to be seen, but not gawked at, appreciated, but not treated like tourist attractions. Chase, however, stepped forward with the swagger of someone who'd made his fortune by pushing boundaries others respected, breaking rules others followed, and turning sacred cows into hamburger. A palace representative in an immaculate morning coat approached the group with the kind of practiced diplomacy that came from years of managing the wealthy and entitled. His vest was perfectly pressed, his navy tie knotted with mathematical precision, and his smile carried just enough warmth to be welcoming without being familiar. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Buckingham Palace. While you're certainly permitted to observe our ceremonial guards, please remember they are on active duty protecting Her Majesty's residence. Direct engagement is strictly prohibited. The guards are under standing orders not to respond to any external provocation, questions, or attempts at interaction." Chase raised his hand like an eager student who'd found a loophole in the teacher's rules. "So you're telling me it's literally impossible to get a reaction out of him?" The tour guide's professional smile tightened almost imperceptibly, the way expensive fabric wrinkles under pressure. "Not impossible, Mr. Chase. Simply extraordinarily unlikely. Our guards undergo rigorous training and take their ceremonial protocol very seriously indeed." Chase's grin widened like a predator scenting weakness. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a slim leather money clip, thick with fresh currency, the kind of cash that most people only saw in movies. The bills were crisp, new, and numerous enough to make several guests unconsciously lean forward to get a better look. £1,000,000, he announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard like a challenge thrown down at medieval joust. "Says I can make that toy soldier break character." The words hit the assembled group like a stone dropped into still water. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Elegant heads turned in unison. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. One elderly duchess actually dropped her programme, the paper rustling against the ancient stones like autumn leaves. Chase's own female assistant took a small but noticeable step backward, already calculating the public relations nightmare this was about to become. The younger assistant's face went pale as he recognized the signs that his boss was about to do something that would trend on social media for all the wrong reasons. A well-dressed woman in pearls that probably cost more than most people's cars whispered urgently to her husband, "He cannot possibly be serious." Her husband, a man whose military bearing was unmistakable despite 20 years in civilian clothes, just shook his head grimly. "Oh, he's serious. And he's about to regret it." Chase patted the money clip against his palm with theatrical flair, enjoying the attention like an actor basking in spotlight. "Dead serious. £1,000,000 sterling. All legal tender. I'll wire it tonight if I lose. Hell, I'll donate it to whatever charity you people are raising money for. Anyone here think I can't make that statue blink?" A tall gentleman in a perfectly tailored navy blazer, his posture and bearing screaming former military officer, spoke with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of commanding men in life-and-death situations. "You're about to receive a very expensive education in British tradition, Mr. Chase." Chase's smile only grew wider, the expression of a man who'd built an empire by betting against conventional wisdom and winning every time. We'll see about that. He moved toward Ashford with the confident swagger of someone who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with enough money and stubborn persistence. The guard's shadow fell across his polished shoes, but Ashford's expression didn't change by so much as a millimetre. Not a flicker of recognition, not a twitch of annoyance, not even the slightest shift in breathing. His eyes remained fixed on that distant point all guards learned to find during their training, somewhere beyond the present moment, beyond provocation, beyond the reach of men like Chase, who thought everything in the world was for sale. "Come on there, buddy," Chase began, his voice carrying the forced friendliness of a car salesman trying to close a deal. "You're really not allowed to react to anything, not even a little bit. What if I told you that hat makes you look like a walking Christmas decoration?" He began mimicking military posture in an exaggerated parody that would have been comical if it weren't so insulting, squaring his shoulders and puffing out his chest like a child playing soldier. "I bet you're just dying to tell me what you really think. Just one word, just one little reaction. I won't tell anyone. Scout's honour." Ashford stared ahead with the kind of stillness that seemed to emanate from his very bones. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he could hear his old sergeant major's voice from basic training, delivered in that gravelly Yorkshire accent that had shaped a generation of soldiers. "A good soldier knows when to fight, lads. A great soldier knows when not to, and the greatest soldiers of all know the difference." This was definitely one of those times to know the difference. Chase leaned closer, close enough that his expensive cologne, something French and probably worth more than most people's weekly groceries, mixed with the clean afternoon air. "Come on, wax figure. Is that what they pay you for, standing around pretending the world doesn't exist? What happens if I do this?" He snapped his fingers directly in front of Ashford's face, the sharp sound echoing off the palace walls. Nothing, not even a blink. "Okay, that's actually impressive," Chase admitted, but his tone suggested he was just getting warmed up. But everyone's got a breaking point. Everyone. 20 minutes passed, like water torture, each moment stretching longer than the last. Chase circled Ashford like a predator stalking wounded prey, trying everything from finger snaps to deliberate clapping near the guard's ear. He asked increasingly personal questions about bathroom breaks, about sneezing fits, about what would happen if a bee landed on his nose. He mimed exaggerated salutes, made jokes about tea and crumpets and the Queen's corgis, and narrated his own performance for the increasingly uncomfortable crowd like some demented nature documentary. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with the theatrical flair of a circus ringmaster, "witness the last vestige of a dying empire. This right here, this is how irrelevant institutions survive, not by being useful, not by being relevant, but by pretending their ridiculous traditions are too sacred to question." Inside the palace's east wing, Lieutenant Graham Worth looked up from his mahogany desk when the radio crackled with a situation report. Worth had served alongside Ashford in Kandahar, had watched him hold position under rocket fire while insurgents tested their defences, had seen him finish a 12-hour shift with dust and blood on his boots and never once complain about the heat or the danger or the mind-numbing tedium of standing perfectly still while people tried to kill you. If Chase thought he'd found an easy target in Reuben Ashford, he was about to learn something fundamental about the difference between performance and principle, between acting tough and actually being unbreakable. "Sir," came the tinny voice through the radio, "we have a situation developing in the main courtyard. American guest is engaging Lance Sergeant Ashford beyond acceptable parameters." Worth set down his pen and walked to the tall window that overlooked the forecourt. Even from 3 stories up, he could see Chase gesticulating wildly while Ashford remained statue still. "How long has this been going on?" 23 minutes and counting, sir. The guest appears to have made some kind of wager." Worth's jaw tightened. "Keep me informed." and make sure we're recording everything." Back in the courtyard, the atmosphere was shifting like weather before a storm. What had started as uncomfortable curiosity was hardening into something else as Chase's behavior escalated from annoying to insulting to downright disrespectful. The other guests, initially amused by the spectacle, were now exchanging worried glances and uncomfortable whispers. "He's serving a myth," Chase declared to his captive audience, his voice rising with each word. "The crown, the uniform, the whole ridiculous pageant, it's all just theatre for tourists. Expensive, outdated theatre that serves no purpose except to separate gullible people from their money." A woman in a pale blue dress, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of being listened to by important people, stepped forward with the deliberate pace of someone who'd had quite enough. "These guards have earned their place through years of distinguished military service, Mr. Chase. Zanhahi. They're not here for your entertainment or your social experiments." Chase waved her off without even looking in her direction, too focused on his target to bother with social niceties. "Everyone's got their price, sweetheart. Everyone breaks under enough pressure. It's just basic human psychology. You just have to find the right button to push." Several more guests shifted uncomfortably. A few began glancing toward the exit. Chase's own assistants looked like they wanted to disappear into the ancient stones beneath their feet. That's when Chase decided to escalate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy golden coin, some kind of commemorative piece that caught the afternoon light like a spotlight. With theatrical deliberation, he dropped it at Ashford's feet, where it rang against the stones with a sound that seemed to echo off every wall of the palace. "Tip for the statue," Chase announced with mock generosity, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the courtyard, "since you're putting on such a good show." The sharp intake of breath from the crowd was audible. Even Chase's own staff looked genuinely uncomfortable now, but their boss was just getting started. He was like a gambler on a winning streak, pushing his luck further and further, convinced that his next bet would be the big payoff. He pulled out his phone, ostensibly to record a private memento for his personal collection. "Live from Buckingham Palace," his voice carried clearly on the audio as he held the device near his mouth, "about to see if centuries of British discipline can withstand good old-fashioned American determination." That's when the first official appeared. A liaison officer in a plain dark suit materialized at the edge of the group with the kind of smooth, practiced approach that suggested extensive training in crowd control and diplomatic incident management. His movement was so fluid it seemed choreographed, like he'd simply stepped out of the palace walls themselves. "Sir," he said in a voice that managed to be both polite and absolutely final, "I'm going to need you to step back immediately. You are currently in violation of ceremonial protocol." Chase laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Violation of what exactly? The man hasn't even blinked. If he can't react, then technically I'm not bothering him, right?" "That's exactly why you need to step away," the officer replied, with the kind of professional calm that came from years of dealing with difficult people who had too much money and not enough sense. "This guard is on active duty, protecting the sovereign's residence. You've tested the boundaries of acceptable behaviour. Now I'm asking you, politely, to return to your group and continue with the scheduled tour." Chase's voice rose, carrying across the courtyard like a challenge. "What are you going to do if I don't? Arrest me for looking at him wrong? This is supposed to be a free country, isn't it?" The officer didn't respond to the provocation. His hands remained folded behind his back, in a posture that somehow managed to be both respectful and ready for action. Ashford, meanwhile, continued to stand in perfect stillness, as if Chase and his tantrum were happening in another dimension entirely. Then Chase made the mistake that would end his afternoon and quite possibly his welcome in the United Kingdom. "What is this guy, anyway?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "The Queen's personal bedside ornament? Do you people make him stand like this in the hospital too? Is this how the monarchy handles end-of-life care?" The silence that followed his words wasn't just uncomfortable, it was electric, charged with the kind of tension that precedes thunder. Every conversation in the courtyard stopped. Every glass paused midway to lips. Even the pigeons seemed to sense something had fundamentally changed. A former military officer in the crowd, his grey moustache precisely trimmed and his bearing unmistakably that of a man who'd spent decades in uniform, stepped forward and spoke with the kind of quiet steel that could cut through armour. "Son," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "I've stood where that man stands, in Helmand Province, in Sangin, in Lashkar Gah. Men like him don't stand still because they're told to. They stand still because they've learned not to move under fire, because they've learned that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is absolutely nothing at all." Chase started to respond, but the older man wasn't finished. "You think this is about pageantry, about tourist shows? That man has probably stood guard while people tried to kill him. He's probably watched friends die and kept his post anyway. And you think you can break him with pocket change and playground insults?" Before Chase could formulate a response, a second official had appeared, older, moving with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to announce his rank or credentials. He leaned toward Chase and spoke just above a whisper, but his words carried the finality of a judge's gavel. "Sir, your presence is no longer welcome on these grounds. A vehicle has been arranged and is currently waiting at the south gate." Chase frowned, finally seeming to realize that his afternoon entertainment had taken a serious turn. "Excuse me, you can't just kick me out for—" "The Crown doesn't recognize your wager," the official continued in that same whisper-quiet voice, "but we absolutely recognize your behavior. You have insulted not just this guard, but the institution he represents and the sovereign he serves. You will leave immediately." For the first time all afternoon, Chase seemed to lose some of his swagger. He looked around at his increasingly uncomfortable entourage, at the faces of the other guests, who were now openly staring at him with expressions ranging from disgust to embarrassment, at the officials who had materialized with such quiet efficiency that they might have been summoned by the ancient stones themselves. "This is absolutely ridiculous," he muttered, but the words lacked the conviction that had carried him through the last hour. "I was just having a bit of fun." "The House of Windsor," the official continued with the patience of someone explaining basic facts to a slow child, "has maintained its dignity for over 1,000 years. We have no tolerance whatsoever for games that insult our servants or mock our traditions. You will depart these grounds immediately, and you will not return." Chase pocketed his money clip with hands that weren't quite as steady as they'd been an hour earlier. As he was escorted toward the side gate by two additional officials who seemed to have appeared from nowhere, several guests approached the ceremonial perimeter where Ashford continued to stand. The woman who had defended him earlier stepped as close as protocol allowed and spoke softly, knowing the guard couldn't respond, but somehow understanding that he would hear every word. "I'm terribly sorry that happened," she said, her voice carrying genuine regret. "That man doesn't represent the rest of us. You don't need to say anything. Your silence said everything that needed saying." An elderly gentleman, clearly a veteran himself, judging by his bearing and the small regimental pin on his lapel, stepped forward next. "Different wars, different uniforms, same pride," he said quietly. "It still matters, son. What you do still matters." Something about Ashford's stillness seemed different now. Not just protocol, but presence. Not just duty, but dignity. Not just a man doing his job, but a symbol of something that couldn't be bought, couldn't be broken, and couldn't be mocked into submission by people who mistook money for meaning. As the sun settled lower across the ancient stones, casting longer shadows across a courtyard that had witnessed centuries of history, the post remained exactly as it was meant to be, unshaken, unbroken, and utterly unbought. When the relief guard arrived for the changing ceremony 40 minutes later, Ashford stepped down from his position with the same precision he'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. As he passed through the arched gateway, disappearing into the palace's service corridors with his bearskin tucked under his arm and his dignity intact, a small boy who had watched the entire confrontation with wide eyes tugged insistently at his mother's hand. "Mummy," he whispered urgently, "he really didn't move. Not even once, not even when that man was being really mean." She smiled down at her son, kneeling to his level with the patience of someone who understood that this had been a teaching moment disguised as entertainment. "Sometimes, darling, the strongest thing you can possibly do is stand absolutely still when everything around you is trying to make you fall down." Inside the palace, Lieutenant Worth was waiting in the quiet corridor with nothing more than a simple nod of acknowledgement. "You held the line, Reuben, just like always." Ashford paused at a service sink to polish his boots with a cloth he kept in his pocket, the same ritual he'd performed thousands of times before in barracks and bases around the world. It was a simple act, but one that spoke to the kind of discipline that went bone deep. "There's following orders," Worth continued, watching his old comrade restore his equipment to perfect condition. "And then there's understanding what you're really protecting. Today, you reminded everyone, including yourself, what that uniform actually means." No reply was needed. None was given. But somewhere in the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, a soldier who hadn't spoken all day allowed himself one quiet breath, and the knowledge that some things in this world really couldn't be bought, no matter how much money someone was foolish enough to waste trying. Have you ever had to stand your ground when someone tried to break your resolve with money, mockery, or pressure? Could you have maintained Ashford's composure with £1 million on the line, and a billionaire inches from your face, hurling insults and trying every trick in the book to make you crack? And what does it say about our world when standing still for your principles becomes a revolutionary act? If this story reminded you that true strength often looks exactly like restraint, and that dignity can't be purchased at any price, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories. Share this with someone who needs to see what unshakable principles look like when they're tested by people who think everything has a price. Our previous videos are appearing on your screen now. Check them out next. We'll see you tomorrow with another brand new story that proves some things in this world are still sacred, still earned, and still worth protecting.